a short introduction of our guest speaker, Jim Rutenberg. I want to give all the time to Jim to do the talking. Besides, if I speak too long, Tony Guida will hit me. These are a few of the things I'd like to say about Jim. 1, Harvey Weinstein's fall opens the floodgates in Hollywood. 2, as the world tweets, social media chiefs remain tight-lipped. 3, Colbert, Kimmel, and the politics of late night. 4, Facebook knows more about Russia's election meddling, shouldn't we? And 5, Trump takes aim at the press with a flamethrower. These are a few of the headlines on Jim's columns, and here we have Jim to tell us about them.
Thank you. I think I've never spoken at a lectern like this. I feel like Bloomberg. I'm just about the same size as he is. I'm beyond honored to the Silurians for having me. And so many familiar faces. For instance, Faggy Rosenthal, who was my research editor at the Daily News, and I have to tell her I found a bag of my old clips that I promised her I would return in 10 minutes to the news recently. Remember the sleeves with the clips that you used to take to your desk? Actually, at the Post, we would get them delivered by carts. I way prefer that to what we have now. So I figured I'd start by telling a little bit about myself and how I wound up in the job I have now, because it kind of says something about what's changed and what hasn't. First of all, are some people drinking here? At least some. Whew. All right, that's good. My career, and I don't know if this happens anymore, started in a bar. It's true. It started at the 55 bar, which was next to the Lion's Head, where all the great newspaper reporters hung out. I could not graduate college. I thought I wanted to be a journalist, and this is what confirmed it for me, that at probably around 1 a.m. every morning, the drunken newspaper bums would get kicked out of the Lion's Head, and they would end up in my bar. And I would guard the door until, let's say after closing time, so they could do what they wanted to do. And I said, what a life. These guys are hanging out till 6 a.m. They get to sleep in and write these awesome columns. That's the job for me. And Dennis Duggan, who I became close with, was definitely like the biggest proponent. I remember 2 things that he said. Jimmy, it's the best fucking job. That was one. And the other one was, just go out. If you want to be in this business, write. Don't just try to impress people with writing, which I can't do anyway, but impress people with your reporting and doing stories that we are going to want. I really wanted to break into the business. I did not have a college degree. I was broke, and I had no clips. So these guys said, get in a car. And it was Lenny Fisher from the Star-Ledger. I don't know if people know Lenny. They said, get in a car and just go offer to sweep the newsroom. And I said, I'm broke. I don't have a car. So they sent me to the now West Side Spirit, then Manhattan Spirit, which was a small weekly newspaper that has always been run by really good young people, and it had a bunch of graduates from Columbia J School, and they kind of sent me out like a missile, just to cover, crime and community boards. And it's a kind of reporting that I will never regret doing, and nobody does it anymore. Fires are small community stories. And our art director was Senator Pat Moynihan's son, John, now deceased, who really wanted to turn it into a brash tabloid. So that's what we did. And so like the school board election, we put a target on a kid's back. When we got on to drug use at Columbia University, John, who would always speak, his father made him, when he was young, work at the Boston Herald to learn about production, just as like a summer job. So he'd say in this, I stumbled on a story about drug use at Columbia University, and John came up with the headline, Columbia's Dark Secret. And that got me my call from the New York Post, come work for us, which I was only too happy to do. And I would have happily spent my life at the Post because it was so much fun. My career there only lasted a few months, alas. And it's kind of one of my first big lessons in journalism was, and we had Colin Miner. Does anyone remember Colin Miner, who's still in the business and works for Patch? He was a young reporter there who worshipped Jack Newfield. And there was talk of a strike. And Colin, then at like 23, tells me at 22, newspapers are always going to break your heart. And and sure enough, the paper was in trouble, as everyone recalls. It went into bankruptcy. And in our wisdom, we decided that it would be a good idea to go on strike because, Rupert Murdoch's going to buy it, but the bankruptcy court will surely accede to our demands. Legally, the bankruptcy court, Murdoch did not have to pay any attention to our strike since the whole union walked out of the building. I had been at Page 6 kind of helping out at the end, which probably saved my career. I was filling in for someone. And I'll make this side note before I finish the strike story, is that that's where you learn how Donald Trump wielded power in this city. The calls would come in. Donald would feed the big stories to the front page, best sex, ever, sources close to Trump, which made the big splashy ones. But he always maintained a level of discussion about himself. And this is all from memory. And I wasn't a byline name in Page 6, so because I was still so young. But he would call in with tips and just kept the chatter going in Page 6. And I only ever recall one specific time when he called one of my colleagues who picked up the phone. Yeah, Donald? Okay, Marla did what? All right, so we're going to quote a source close to you. What should that source say? How about he says da-da-da? And then, hey, Jim, just type it up. And that was it, right into the Page 6. But anyway, so we're going on strike. And I'll never forget this. I qualified for the union that day. I'd been at the paper just long enough. And I said to Joe Nicholson, who was our unit head, what do I do, Joe? Do I join the union? There's no way I'm going to scab. There's no way I'm going to scab. And he says, no, leave the building. Just go home sick. So that seems like an okay idea. I get busy. I don't get to leave the building. We start walking out. Barry Lipton, who was the head of the guild, is there. And he asked me, are you in the union? I say, no, but I'm eligible today. He says, here, fill out this card. I fill out the card. We're walking down the steps. There wasn't that much information. And I change my mind just as I see that it requires a $5 initiation fee. And I say to Barry, I don't have the $5. I'm not, and he said, I'll spot you. So we go on strike. And another thing that doesn't change for me personally is dealing with Rupert Murdoch. Murdoch breaks the strike pretty quickly by a really crazy but cool move in terms of just the story of it. The truckers were with us in the beginning, and one afternoon Murdoch sends a big gas truck to the building on South Street, and they put the hoses into the building, and we say, what's going on here? And they say, we're taking the ink. So he drained the building of the ink, the presses, and that was the end of the strike. So we all got, this is memory, so fact check, but I'm going to take a speaker's license, but that's how I remember it. And so we all get invited nicely to reapply for our jobs. Mark Kalish, who's the managing editor, calls me at home. I'm in Hoboken. I'm still kind of broke, but you would get paid in cash at these cages down on like the second floor. So I was like throwing the money around, but I still hadn't gotten a refrigerator. And Mark Kalish calls me and says, you're coming back in tomorrow. You're not in the union, are you? And I said, Mark, I don't think so. Like, I didn't pay the initiation. Well, the phone never rang. But because I ran gossip, I wound up making my way to the Daily News. And at the Daily News, I ran gossip for a while, got hired by the city desk, covered the subways. And the Daily News was is a great paper. I would never regret anything. I've learned so much from the news. And so my editor, Marianne Giordano, was going to the Observer, and I was ready to give up on doing daily journalism because I'd found my way to get an ulcer at 29, just from like the stress of covering. I covered the subways, I covered breaking news, and the Times had said it would never hire me. it was never going to hire me because I think my clips were not good enough and not written enough. So Marianne took me to the Observer, and within I guess the Times could see I could write. So within a year, I was brought into the Times, and I was brought into the Times to cover media, that led naturally after a year or two to politics because I would cover sort of the ads and the news industry, but it was still different. It was still outside of politics. And the interesting thing is that leads to politics. I go on to, I'll shorten this now, I cover the White House. I covered a couple campaigns. And then I was ready to leave politics, and I was offered this column. So I took the media column recently, and I think like, okay, that's it. I'm done with politics. That's it. And here I am writing about Trump and politics yet again. So it's all kind of come full circle. That it was like media led to politics. Now politics leads back to media because it's all one under the Trump administration. But I think we were going here anyway. So now I cover everything I cover. I've kind of lived through politics and covering media. We're dealing with a new level of press hate, but that's not really new either for us because I remember, I'll never forget covering the Yankees 1996 parade when they first won, and we're on the float. The press would go in this rear float, and they're cheering the Yankees, and every player's in a float ahead of us, and our truck comes up. It says press on the side, and in the beginning, it's press, 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 and then it kind of dawns on the crowd that it's the press. And the next thing we know, we are getting pelted in our heads with like clumped up confetti just hitting us in our heads. And Mark Kriegel, who was a great sports columnist at the time, said, "Say hello to your readers, motherfucker." So anyway, we've been here before. These are treacherous times. The financial problems, as I said, were not new, but they're even more threatening. We are now in a world where we are reliant on, at times, billionaires to kind of save our papers. We have new threats, but new opportunities through Facebook and through Twitter, which is at the same time a big problem in terms of draining our resources, but giving us new exposure. So it's an interesting, treacherous time. Covering Trump, I think that for those of us who grew up in New York media, we're well equipped for it because we know how he deals, and he's running, as Maggie Haberman, Clyde's daughter, says often. He's running his White House sometimes like a mayoralty. In terms of the way he deals with press. I think what we learned working the New York tabloids works well for Twitter, being brash and a little in your face and short. We're always told pictures and words matter, and that's still the case. So I guess somehow I ended up in this damn job, having to field all this stuff. It's been a lot more intense than I expected, but that's a good thing, and that's what I got. So I think I could keep talking, but I'm much more interested in the questions you all are going to have here.
I want to express gratitude for the columns you've been doing, and to ask you, I think it was Monday, your column about the decree from management that New York Times people are to be very careful in expressing personal views. I'm wondering what, if any, reaction you got from management to that column.
Nobody said a word to me about, I mentioned that the Times has a new social media policy that they announced on Friday, if everyone doesn't know, that was basically if you can't say it under the banner of the paper, giving your role at the paper, then don't say it. And I kind of, even though I'm on board with that policy, I kind of made fun of it in the column just because a joke made itself, the opportunity to make a joke and crack on us a little arose. But nobody said anything to me about that column, which means they probably just didn't read it on Monday. But anyway, I think the reason I'm on board with that policy is because I do think that the tweeting has gotten, a little, sometimes you just see things that people do who are supposed to be straight news reporters and you wince a little bit. There's an interesting debate because some people said, well, good, now we know where they stand. I don't know. Again, I was raised in this business that your goal is to just report the story. If you're an opinion person, it's different. But your goal is to just report the story. So, and it is to put aside your own biases. Of course, you have them. Some people larger degrees than others, but that's not the job. And once you do that, you really confuse the job. And as a former White House reporter, I know that when someone on the arts desk would say something about President Bush that went public, I had to deal with that in my job. And I just also think it's just not very, you have to keep in mind that we have colleagues who are dealing with this administration every day. It's already really hard. Even if you're not part of that coverage, why make it harder for them? It's all within reason, because the pressures now, which was new, when I got to the Times, you were supposed to subsume your identity, that you are now part of the hive. It's not about you, especially as a kid. I mean, I was there, a kid, 30. I started there in 2000, and you were lucky just to be in the door at that age. Now they want the paper. It does send a mixed signal, because it wants young reporters to establish themselves on Twitter, get followings. It helps get our stuff read. It's good for them professionally. So there's a balance. But again, I was seeing personally, and I've said this before, too many tweets that made me sort of, didn't feel comfortable with them.
Thanks for coming here to share some of your history with us. I'm curious, so what do you think is inevitable with Facebook? Do you think that they will become more of a news organization over time, or will there be government regulation, or what scenario do you see playing out?
I think that Facebook is going to have to face some regulation. And what strikes me is they don't see, every time they come and say, all right, we get it, we're going to change, or we're going to get on top of this problem. Currently, the problem obviously being that they've shown they're vulnerable to Russian interference, or they've shown that they can give a state like the Russians an opening to interfere with our election. They've also shown that you can run political ads on their platform in a way you can on television, that we haven't really seen this before, right? Like, someone buys a TV ad, it's got to be public. The organizations that buy ads are often shady, but at least there's something that, as a reporter and as a public, you can go and see on the logbook at the station who bought this, how much time, what shows it's running in. You don't know with Facebook. So they now are saying, oh, we finally get it. Mind you, they said there was no problem. In the beginning, this was laughable, right? It was crazy that they would have affected our election at all. So now they always give just enough to try to get the pressure off themselves, but they never seem to go the extra mile. And just in talking to some of them, and I do have to say that many of the people I speak with are well-intentioned, smart people, but I've found sometimes their own good intentions maybe blind them to the effects of what's going on. And they still don't understand why everyone's putting all the heat on them, and what about all the good things they do? And that's always like the classic, that's what Trump says sometimes, right? Like, but when you're in a certain position, you're going to get criticism, and when the criticism is valid, hopefully you address it, especially with the power they have. They are so powerful now.
Jim, I'm in the 17th century when it comes to computers and all that sort of stuff.
Congratulations.
So I want to get even more basic. I've watched this over the years, and I have come to the conclusion that we are being overwhelmed by an electronic Tower of Babel. What do you think?
Well, I'm on record, to an extent, agreeing with you. What I have to look at too is the great opportunities that social media does give. We see new journalists emerging from social media and getting exposure and doing really smart, cool stuff. So there's a lot good that's coming out of social media. But I do think that it's becoming, sometimes you go on Twitter and it's just like this sludge pit. It's just so unpleasant to be on Twitter sometimes. At the same time, it's giving me news in the way that the old wire never could. So it's a mixed bag. I just think that they have to play a part in dealing with the ill effects. Because the answer sometimes is, we're trying. We don't know what to do, but we're trying. It's like they have created this world, and yes, we all like its benefits, but they have to find ways to sort of address the problems that are emerging, and maybe get ahead of some too.
Hi, Jim.
Myron.
I watched last week when you moderated the discussion with your boss and Peter Baker and my one-time copy girl, Maggie Haberman. And I watched on the Times website, and I submitted a question for you to ask them. So my first question is, why didn't you use my question?
I think I knew it was from you.
So the question I would have presented was, today, your assignment is to write Trump's obituary. What's your lead?
Oh, no.
What's your legacy?
I wouldn't be the guy writing that. I'd be writing the media column.
The question was actually like for Maggie and Peter.
Yeah, that's a hard one. Huh. I can't do it on the spot, but I'll think about it, I promise. Can I say one thing about Myron, though? Like, Myron was like, when I worked with Myron, and again, it was my first big newspaper job, it was like watching a conductor. You know, these calls would come in, we all sat in this kind of square at the Post, and Myron would be like, Rutenberg, 6, you know, Haberman, 8, you know, just, and running the slide, it was like an art form, you know, and it was so cool. I personally missed that kind of camaraderie and the way a newsroom used to work. It was awesome. Myron was the best at it. Gypsy Impala no, he didn't quite have the same role at the news, but you know, there was just a great newsroom spirit that you know, we still have some, but it's not like it was. It was great.
Can I point out that's the real Myron, not me? Jim, first of all, as an educator, I really admire your having reached the heights you have without a college degree. I really think that's an
I tell all the kids, you don't need one.
You know,
don't worry about it.
But I have a question about the Times today. What do you think of the proliferation of first-person stories in the Times?
That is a good question. I'll start with what the editors say. And the editors really want that because the younger reporters, the younger readers apparently really are drawn to that. That what they don't like anymore is the sort of above-it-all voice of the Times. Now, that doesn't go for everyone, and so the feeling is we have to loosen up a little bit. And in some of the foreign reporting, you know, we had something out of, was it maybe out of Raqqa? We had some story I read in the last day or two where a photographer gave first-person accounts of being in the war zone. And that was valuable because apparently what we were finding was readers didn't even know that our writers or photographers, they knew the photographers obviously, but they didn't know the writers were in the war zone or on the scene. So they didn't realize what datelines meant. They didn't realize if it had, you know, a Baghdad dateline, we have a bureau in Baghdad. So it's been helpful. I think they would have to admit that sometimes it feels too, like I was taught not to do that. Now that I'm a columnist and I'm allowed to do it, it's like, oh, everyone can do it now, you know? But no, just kidding, kind of. No, but I was taught not to do that, but I do think that their reason for it is to kind of make the stories more relatable. I think they would admit that sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. They're playing with it. And so you'll just see that adjust, hopefully, where it'll hit the right tone, and I think sometimes it doesn't, but we're working on it.
Hi. My time at 55 must have ended before you got there. Anyway.
Were you a regular?
Yes.
How late did you tend to stay?
I usually was at Bradley's.
Oh, same crew. Yeah.
Anyway, in keeping with the current White House practice, I'll ask my unrelated follow-up question first. I don't understand why it's in the economic interest of publishers and editors to have reporters give up their stories on Twitter in advance of publication. But that's not my real question. My real question is, in retrospect, what do you think was the biggest miss of the media coverage of Trump in the year and a half before the election?
That's a good question. I've written some on that. The most obvious miss was the idea that how serious he was as a contender and that he could win. And I think that's in part, and I've written this too, because a lot of the sort of new tools that we use to prognosticate were sort of maybe misused. And it's a tricky business, right? Like we had this bug on our homepage that would show, and it was always there, you know, Hillary Clinton's chances are like 90% or at times. Now, what the data team would tell you is they don't mean she's 90%, she has 90% in the polls. It means if you run a model of how this election is going to turn out, 9 times out of 10, she won. And they're saying that just, they could tell you there's only a 10% chance of rain tomorrow and it rains. And I get that. I still think it seeped into the consciousness a little bit for everybody. Certainly some readers did not read it that way, didn't quite understand it in that way. So that solidified their perception. And then a lot of our sources would say, who we'd had for years and longer than, decades, say, no way, this cannot happen. And I think that sunk in far too much. But it's not about the horse race. Then you wonder what stories didn't get covered because we didn't take him seriously, or was the serious coverage a little bit late? Because there was a point where he gets a nomination, it clicks in a lot more. So people from the Rubio campaign would tell you that when they came out of the gate, their coverage was way harder, and Trump was treated. And I haven't done an analysis to see if they're right, but that's their assertion. And we do know that when Trump came out, there was a certain sort of, okay, this is a novelty. Isn't this going to be interesting? It's fun. And what I used to call novelty candidacies. So I think that was a big problem. What I would say in defense of the coverage everywhere is that we did do a lot of really good investigative work on him and raised questions about him that have borne out in his presidency. So readers, and that goes for the Post and a lot of other great news organizations, is that people I don't think there are many surprises in terms of how he's governing. I think we did a good job of saying, here's what it would look like. But I think the original sin was not taking him seriously enough. And, that probably led to some other issues.
Behind you. Over here. Behind it, this way. Behind you, right over here. Okay, right here. Right. Okay, looking ahead to the next election and the Russians. Are we going to be able to control this and to defeat what they are doing, which, as you so well described, was formidable?
Right now, I would say no, because they're still doing it. Right? Like I can tell when you've got like a big, at least a troll campaign where you can tell that you're being attacked on social media or someone else is being attacked on social media, and the accounts that are springing up and getting in on the act just are very suspicious. So the social media companies still have not done a great job in terms of getting on top of this. Charlottesville, there's very clear evidence that Russian bots jumped on that. You could name the story, and there's certainly outside interference. And to me, that's the other thing that what social media has wrought is this. We used to call it working the refs, where there's a journalistic component where people like George Arst, is he here? Yeah. Would call him work you, and people would try to sping you, respectfully always with George. But now you have these bots telling you you're, maybe they're really nasty, like you're a dirty Jew, or something like that. And then you look and it's like, that Twitter account has 2 followers, right? But it's getting in everybody's heads, and, I think reporters have adjusted, but it's just these new tools to cause trouble at the same time that they're new tools that brought about, the Arab Spring.
Jim, when Maggie was here, one of the most interesting things she said was the role of The Apprentice in creating Donald Trump, the candidate. Could you talk a little bit about the role of TV and other media in actually creating popularity for candidates, as opposed to, assessing what their positions are or assessing what their personalities are?
Yeah, it's huge, and I think it runs in tandem with other mistakes we've made in media. But yeah, Donald Trump was, he wasn't just a television star. He was the leading television star on one of the biggest broadcast networks. I mean, he was the #1 show in television for a time. So people knew him as this character they wanted to spend time with. And that was always what I was always taught as a political journalist, was the candidate who people want to spend time with and can deal with it in their living room is the one who's going to win. Now, I'm sure that there's a huge segment of New Yorkers who don't want to spend time with him in their living room. But, and he didn't get a majority of the popular vote, but he won the Electoral College, and he's a big television star. And, I think that coincided with a sort of cheapening of not just politics, but maybe some of the coverage, where debates became, the prelude to debates on CNN, for instance, where it's a sports contest and there literally were like explosions and boxing gloves hitting, and it all became a game. So did anybody really want to debate on a shout fest on cable the nuances of a tax proposal? I always thought what was undercovered was his plans on immigration, which he's another thing I was taught very early, and Robin Toner, now deceased, but one of our beloved political correspondents, was that presidents not always, but tend to do what they say they're going to do in their campaign. So that wasn't getting as much attention, and we all know this, and we see it still, as Marco Rubio is not that well endowed. I forget how he said it. the joke about hands and all the dumb smash mouth stuff that got headlines and got everybody going. So here we have a television star forcing a television approach into the campaign with a media that was getting there with him and maybe even preceded him.
Jim, here.
What about Trump threatening NBC and the license? Is anything to worry about? Or
I mean, my job is to always worry about that in my role. So I think that's what we're all trying to figure out. That a president making a threat like that maybe their license should be revoked. NBC, of course, the license wouldn't be revoked for NBC Broadcast Network National. It would be revoked for its stations. Is potentially chilling. And in the early part of the administration, I'm concerned always about it. I was a lot more concerned because I was worried, like, when are people going to start buckling and what's that going to look like? And in a way, what we've seen is that there's a new resolve in the press not to buckle because of it. And that there are, for whatever you want to say about our standing with the public, there is some large segment of the public that wants us to do our job as it was envisioned by the founders of the country. So far it's just rhetoric, but everybody in journalism, in the legal community, and in corporate America, in Congress, is waiting for that moment and kind of hoping it doesn't come, where there's a move where the rubber meets the road. Is there some move against the license? Does some ally of the president's file a complaint with the FCC, against the NBC station in Tallahassee, you name it. So similarly, his threats about the press and leak investigations, the first investigation where some reporter is getting subpoenaed in some new aggressive way, that'll be the time. So it's very worrisome, but it could go a lot farther, and it hasn't yet.
Jim, the president has said that many of us in this room are the enemies of American society. Are you concerned that not only during his presidency, as short or as long as it's going to last, will have a lasting impact on the way the American public views the press?
I'm really worried about that, and it's interesting. I had a conversation with one of his people a little bit ago now, where we were talking through some of these issues, and this person said, "Well, you've been really tough on us. You've really tough." And I said, when you say my colleagues and I are, we're enemies of the American people, like, I can't abide by that as a media columnist. Like, it's just not. I can't sit with that. It's not okay. I don't know, because there was some poll that showed like trust in the media came up a little bit, but and trust is really important. It's still not where we'd all want it to be, but also we're not politicians. Like, our job is to tell people shitty news, right? So I don't know what we can really do about it. With some segment of the public, what I'd worry about is, even if the majority of Americans appreciate what we do, even if they disagree with us, there might be some subset of the public that is lost forever to journalism. And that would be really bad, because then you get the social platforms helping them get fake stuff to feed certain worldviews, maybe some of it a little, really threatening and causing bigger problems in the culture, Russia coming in. That's the problem, but I don't know yet.
Well, just to follow up on that, let's assume that Mueller comes out with a very negative report on the Trump campaign and its relationship with the Russians, right? Now, Trump and his acolytes in the White House will say, that's fake news. Don't believe it.
Yes.
Do we have to worry about that?
In a way, you'd worry about that, because what you don't have to worry about is that if it triggers certain legal challenges and certain wheels in motion, that no public perception doesn't matter in that process. And we've seen that the courts again and again end up following the law in a way that the administration isn't happy with. It foils their plans that don't pass muster legally. What you would worry about, and I think there was some concern about this when not everyone, but when people expected Clinton to win, what would his supporters say? Would they think that the system was rigged? You know, how angry would they be? I mean, now you're seeing that on the other side. But so it's never good if you have some segment of the population that's not going to believe this, and while the system starts doing what it has to do with that information and people aren't accepting it, what's the outcome? What's that end up looking like out in the real world? So I don't know. I mean, I gathered during Watergate, I was only 3 or 4 years old, that there was more of a bipartisan kind of consensus, right? I'm sure like certain people like Roger Ailes were pissed about how it went down, but there was a bipartisan consensus that these crimes were, untenable.
We have time for 3 more good questions.
Jim, you mentioned Roger Ailes, but here we are with Fox News. You've got Ailes gone, Bill O'Reilly is gone, Megyn Kelly is losing over at NBC, but Fox News continues to be #1. What happened?
I'm not at all surprised by that, personally. Because if you look, again, to go to the polls, people who identify themselves not as Republicans per se, but as conservative or independent but leaning conservative, there's only one news network they trust, and it's Fox. If you go and look at the ideological spectrum going from sort of past that center line to the left, you see dozens of outlets that people trust. And you could say some of that is because the mainstream media doesn't lean left. I mean, we all know that often it does. But it could also be because what Fox's branding has been is we are the only one you can trust. You can't trust them, especially at night, that the mainstream media is, they're dishonest brokers. I mean, watch Sean Hannity. So if the branding is that, then they're still going to stick with Fox, And also, Roger Ailes infused the place with a real sort of production sensibility and television showmanship that keeps an audience too. So there's a lot going on there.
Okay, how can the intelligentsia appeal to a population that is dominated by people who are not intelligentsia? If you understand what I mean.
I count myself as one of the not intelligentsia or not intelligent, but I do. I think that this is something our editors have spoken to, is that we can't be talking to just certain people in Manhattan, Washington, Los Angeles. That we have to be doing coverage that's interesting to everybody. I would assert that we, at the Times, do more of that than we get credit for. Like one thing that the editors had said at the time was, we're going to get people out into the country. I mean, we do have bureaus throughout the country. Those stories don't always get the play on or don't get the web traffic they deserve because they're like really great stories. We did one on, the lives of truck drivers. It was really compelling and great. So we're trying to tell, at least to the extent we were doing a bad job at it, we're trying to do a better job. I would say we were doing a little more of it than we get credit for. But it is like, we can't be having a conversation only with ourselves. And Twitter is still a problem in that regard, I think, because a lot of Twitter is also just journalists talking to each other and kind of bolstering their kind of worldview. So, I think we hired a veteran for a magazine job, a military veteran. So we're trying to mix it up in some hiring too. But I think everyone's got to get out of their bubbles. I was going to say that in a different way and remember this august setting.
Sort of, going back to the election a little bit and sort of lessons learned from the election, do you think that, I'm just we've been talking about coverage of Trump, but what about coverage of Hillary? And what about coverage of the campaign and whether there was a double standard, as a lot of people feel, and what are we going to draw from that for the next election?
Right,
what do you think of the coverage of her?
So you're right, because you see a lot of I think we get a lot of blowback on Twitter, like something will happen with the Trump administration, and the mocking tweet is, "But her emails," and people think we overcovered that. I almost want to sit. I'm not the ombudsman. I'm happily not the ombudsman. Now we don't have an ombudsman, so a lot of people want me to be the ombudsman. I want to sit and sift through that coverage with no distractions for a week before I kind of come down with some conclusive thing to say about it. But I get it. I get the complaint. It probably consumed a lot of coverage. There was a story that was bad, right? That had said kind of dismissed the Russian investigation, or it seems off, where our coverage has since kind of caught up with that and then some, and now we're breaking tons of stories, thank God, and so are our competitors. But one of the things that gets cited a lot is our coverage when Comey sent that letter, and that was a big moment, right? We didn't invent that story, so I don't know how you don't put that on the front page. But again, people feel this so strongly that, and the news environment for me is such that I'm running. Okay, people that I really want to sit with it and run through it in my own head. Obviously, there's some validity to it. In some of the cases, I don't see how we don't cover it as a big deal. And it's unquestionably true that once the newsroom starts thinking that someone's going to be the next president, the scrubbing, the vetting, the focus really changes. And this is going to be the next president. We better. And so, again, I would have to go through and look. But just being in this business for whatever 25 years, that's just how it works. So there's no question.
Have the events in the Trump administration, what their activities and just the noise they managed to create around themselves, has it affected coverage of non-Trump related international news?
I don't know if it's covered. I don't know if it's affected coverage per se. Some, the short answer is
extent of it?
A little bit, or maybe in some cases a lot bit. I know my column has had to be, I was taking this column and I thought I'd be writing about the changing media landscape and a lot more about Facebook and, the magazine industry, which I have hardly got to write. I haven't had a chance to write about that much yet. So it's affected what I do. And I also know, that we now have analytics and we see what the readers are hungry for, and it's got a lot. And bosses do not say, unlike some of our competitors do have, it's in their performance review how their clicks are. We don't have that, but we see them, so it's got to be in the back of your mind. This is what people are reading. So, and then there are things that the resources that are going to scrubbing the administration and covering the administration mean that other things aren't going to get covered as much. But what I'm sort of fascinated by or a little bit disheartened by at times is that, because we do a lot of coverage about the world and it's not getting the same clicks. Doesn't mean we're not going to put it on the homepage and spend the money, but sometimes some of the same readers who say, why do you have to cover him? And you should be covering all these other issues in the world. I'm not convinced that they're actually then going and reading those stories. Or not enough. So, because I may do a column on this. You look at the numbers and huge important stories. The readership wants Trump to a huge degree.
Jim, I said three. Hold on. I said 3 more questions, but I lied.
If you go on the web rather than your paper, you will always see 3 stories about Trump.
Yes.
But if you are looking for anything other than some war somewhere, you are not going to find any international news.
Right, on the home, you're saying on the homepage?
Well, when you first come up, and then you keep going through.
Right.
And so I'm not talking about the paper, but I'm talking about what most people look at now.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that my guess is they're putting Trump on because it does have the clicks.
Yeah, I'm not saying that's not the case. I'm saying we're still doing stuff.
We don't see them, though.
Yeah. Well, today's a bad example because there's a lot of news coming out of. So my head today is I think we do have a lot of news out of the Middle East. But yeah, I think that happens a lot. I mean, I'm saying in terms of reporters, no one's saying do this for clicks. And the stories are still getting on the homepage, but would they be on the home page a lot more? Absolutely, totally. Similarly, when my column doesn't get the homepage I want, and I see some Trump thing or a celebrity thing getting play, I kind of have my suspicions about what's going on. Though maybe my column sucked that week, it's quite possible. But so it's all at play. But what I'm saying is, no one's saying do this because of this. But then it's in your mind, like, oh, nobody read that, But I know you're talking about play.
Jim, final question.
Yes.
Softball. Is the Times failing?
We're not failing. We're not failing. Thank
Tell
God.
us why not.
Well, our subscriptions are way up. I think our profits are up. We're making changes in the newsroom that have led to cuts that bum me out personally, because I think some really good seasoned journalists are leaving the paper who I see as part of the DNA, but they're also hiring new people. So again, I started the paper in 2000, and I've been there for some really low times, and this feels the closest thing to the early days there for me, when it was still Joe Lelyveld and we were really humming. It's not that. I mean, what I wonder about is if Trump goes away tomorrow and the story somehow normalizes and it's not like the huge thing it is, do we still kind of get to keep these new readers? Do people still burn to read what we're writing? That'll be a true test.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. You are now an honorary Silurian. And we will see everybody November 15th in the evening for the Lifetime Achievement Award dinner. Thank you.